right, everybody. Welcome to the second part of our lecture series, Rethinking Planning in Florida. Last semester we had three speakers. We started with Tom Pelham, then we had Robert Yarrow, and then we had Charlie, and they basically talked about rethinking planning in Florida. They talked about what the planning system was, what alternative approaches was, and then Charlie basically said, we need a different approach. What we're going to do in this semester is we're going to have two lectures where we're going to talk about, I think Charlie called it developing the intellectual infrastructure for a new approach. And then in March, we will have a symposium where we're actually going to invite a whole bunch of people to talk about what that new approach might look like. Right. So it's my great pleasure today to have Will Zonneveld. He's a professor. He is the program leader of the OTB Urban Studies Research Group. And I'm sorry, I still don't know what OTB stands for. Okay. So this is the use of acronyms in the Netherlands. It stands for nothing. His tasks include supervising research projects, promoting quality, quantity, cohesion of the research output, supervising junior researchers, project leadership, all the good stuff that we all have to do as professors. He has special expertise in the field of strategic spatial planning at the regional, national, European levels. He has worked on assignments for organizations such as the European Commission, the Ministry of Housing in the Netherlands, the Ministry of Housing, Spatial Planning and Environment in the Netherlands, and local and regional organizations. I looked up his publications, and I figured I'm going to highlight some of them. And I printed them out, and since 2000, this is 17 pages. So I'm not even going to try. Needless to say, this man has written a whole lot of very interesting works. We invited him because of David Prosperi, who has met Will quite some times. We've also been to OTB, and he has actually done some presentations. But I actually really like the contribution in this book, in which he talks about how you can use images to persuade people and to show what planning is all about. We had some conversations today and yesterday in which he talked about planning, and I was really surprised when he talks about there are two ways of communicating. There are words and there are images. And when he talks about words, it was very clear to me that he wasn't talking about the words that we use. He was talking about things like metaphors and concepts. So a very different approach. So with that, please join me in welcoming Will Zonneveld from Delft.
Well, thank you very much, Jaap, for these kind words. What I'm trying to convince you is that spatial planning is founded, derives part of its rationale from ideas and perceptions about desired spatial development and desired spatial structures. You can also say planning is supported by visions, and if I describe it in this way, then visualization is and becomes, is that my telephone still? Okay. Visualization is a key component of planning. And why is that? Because spatial planning is dealing with territory, dealing with space. And these are objects, domains, which you can visualize. You can make them visible through visualization. And you can use many different techniques. In the book you just been presenting, there's a whole array of scales you can use on different levels of scales, but not every technique is applicable to every scale. For instance, photographs are becoming quite meaningless on very high levels of scales, and you have to use other techniques. I mainly want to discuss with you planning on higher levels of scale, and then the most important visual instrument to be used is formed by maps. Maps can lead to consensus, but also to confusion and conflicts. Possibly more than words, but I'm not certain about that. In both domains you can reach consensus through words, to metaphors, another type of words, but also conflicts. Now I have to find this. Yep. This was the title page of the presentation. These are a few books on the subject. On the two books on the left, you might know them. There's this very well-known book of Dennis Wood, The Power of Maps. A very meaningful title. It mainly discusses maps which have analytical purposes, but even those maps which have analytical purposes, want to show knowledge, are written with power. And that's why Dennis Wood gave his book The Power of Maps. In the middle there's a kind of, how you say it, there's a new edition of the book. He added more thinking about the power of maps. What I should have done, but I didn't do, there's Will I introduced a very interesting reader on maps, space and maps. I can give the title to Jaap in the later stage. It has a large collection of essays, very important articles on maps and the way people use and misuse maps. Quite a few very interesting theoretical papers are in that. And on the right you can see a reworking of the PhD of Steffi Duur, working at the University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands, and she is discussing the use of maps, or even broader, the visual language of spatial planning. Worth reading. But on the basis of the fact that maps have power, some conclude that no maps at all should be used in spatial planning. And now I'm referring to... Sorry? Okay. Thank you. I'm referring to a discussion in the JAPA, the Journal of the American Planning Association, about a decade ago. And in that journal, a paper has been published, written by two Dutch scholars, Michel van Eeten and Van Roo. And they say that the use of maps leads to something which they called iconographic gaze. And they were talking about a famous concept in Dutch planning, that's the green heart concept. I'm not certain whether you know it, I'm not going to tell all details about it, but green heart basically means there's a large urban structure in the western part of the Netherlands in the form of a ring of cities, and in the middle there's an open space. And that open space, I'll come back to that later in my talk, that open space should be kept open as a kind of large metropolitan green belt. And this policy has been supported over the years by maps. But the concept of a green heart turned somewhat into a kind of doctrine. So untouchable, you cannot change it. And these two Dutch scholars were saying that's the fault of using maps. Maps are forcing people to think in one way, so we should get rid of maps at all to prevent that planning becomes a closed doctrine. They got opposition from this viewpoint from Ernest Alexander, maybe you know him, and I'm going to quote him, that some form of graphic representation is essential for communicating any ideas that have a spatial dimension. And it could be maps, it could be diagrams, and I'll show you a variety of that. These are the type of maps Van Eeten and Roo were talking about. I find themselves quite innocent, but of course how you perceive maps, that can be very, very different. On the left, that's from a national policy report from the 1980s, showing the perimeters of the Randstad. And on the right hand, in very pleasant, optimistic colors, well, I find them very pleasant and optimistic, it's just a bunch of projects in the Green Heart and around the perimeters of the Green Heart to improve its spatial quality and to improve its functionality in terms of accessibility and things like that. So what am I going to do? I will discuss all sorts of examples of visualization, map making on the transnational level, also on the level of the Randstad. Now I'm going to warn you. The Randstad, that's a Dutch word. Randstad is a metaphor. Rand means edge or rim, and stad means city. So we're talking about a rim city. And what is the rim? This is the rim, this area. If you close your eyes a bit, then you can see it. And that's how our planets are often working, and urban designers are often working. And that's how a concept like Randstad or Rim City comes about. And this is the line of the Green Heart. And a scholar in the Netherlands, Andreas Faludi, said this was the dead end of a kind of dead end of the Green Heart, not because it was visualized, but because politicians found it necessary to draw a perimeter around the Green Heart, and planets at lower levels of government, provinces and municipalities have to be exactly clear what this line means here. Which road, which ditch, which meadow forms the perimeter of the Green Heart, and then it becomes a closed doctrine. And it's not a consequence of this map, but it's a consequence of a decision which has been mapped. Okay, I will leave it here. So I will talk about various visualizations about the Randstad and bits of the Randstad, and then I will round off with some observations. I will go to a much higher level of scale than the Randstad or even the Netherlands. This is acronym, it's Benelux. Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg. And historically this is a kind of anti-chamber. Benelux has been a kind of anti-chamber for European integration. Involvement is an intergovernmental form of cooperation. Intergovernmental means you don't raise up certain competences at a higher level of scale. Each country keeps its own competence, but you sit together, you talk together, negotiate together, and you make agreements on certain types of policy. And the involvement of Benelux in spatial planning started in the late 60s as a kind of platform to discuss relationship between different forms of planning in the different parts of Benelux. The decision was made to draw up a kind of structural vision for Benelux in the 1980s, and that resulted in this map. I will show you the key in a moment. What this map basically does, or what the structural outline as a whole does, it mirrors the planning policy of the Netherlands in that period of time, middle 1980s. So this part of Benelux, as a kind of mirror, it projects it on the southern part of the Benelux. This map created a lot of conflict. And why? Maybe there was one part of Belgium which opposed this map. And do you have any idea which part of Benelux that is? You may not know the name. Well, let me answer this riddle. Belgium is formed by 3 regions. There's Flanders, here. There's the Brussels capital region. And this is Wallonia, this part. And the representatives of Wallonia opposed this map because they were saying what this map shows is that Walloon is a kind of green desert, a désert vert. So a previous version of this map was unacceptable for the representatives of Walloon. And now I'm going to show you, look at this map, I'm going to show you the key and the map. I'm not certain who's able to read French, because that's the only non-Dutch language here, because the Benelux is bilingual, Dutch and French. To save the Benelux structural outline as a whole and this map, the makers of this map invented a new category in the key of the map. And that's how we use it. Yes. This means center in rural area and center with a special function for the surrounding area. And although it's not very impressive, it does change a bit the outlook of this area by inventing these two categories and projecting them on this part of Belgium. So this is almost on an anecdotal level, but it shows you maps can be very useful to express what kind of policy you want to follow, but it also can raise conflicts. And often, and I'm going to show other examples, makers of maps like this, let's call them planners, are not always aware of what kind of issues and conflicts maps lead to. So that's something to be very aware of. There has been a follow-up of this structural outline, and in fact I've been participating in the group who made this follow-up. It's a new Benelux structural outline around 1996 and now 1997, and we as a group of spatial planners and urban designers, among them Jeff van der Broek, when I know at least one person in this room knows him, that's David Prosperi. He was the project manager of the group. We made a mistake. I think ultimately I must conclude we made a mistake. This is a completely different language, which you can see if you compare it with the other map. This is not about urban form. The previous map was saying that urban agglomerations should have a kind of defined perimeters. There should be open spaces between them, buffer zones, green belts. This is entirely about different subjects. And what is interesting, I'm going to show you this map. This map takes the borders of the Benelux as the borders of the structural outline in total, and also of the maps. I'm still talking in the we form, we didn't do that, because we thought that certain important spatial relationships between areas do cross borders. Regional borders, municipal borders, but that's when this structural outline is not about. They cross national borders. So we have drawn images of cross-border urban networks, like this one, which includes Lille and Tourcoing and Kortrijk in Belgium. And this one is another one, Maastricht, Aachen, Liège. And we also draw, just to position the Benelux in a wider context, we drawn a few urban networks, the symbolized urban networks outside the Benelux area. But the major thing in this map is that we want to emphasize, we want to draw attention to the fact, if you look at the Benelux from a wider geographical perspective, then it's quite striking that you have on a very short distance, very large, very important demographically but also economically urban networks. The Randstad, what has been called the Flemish Diamond, Antwerp, Ghent, Leuven, Brussels, a Walloon triangle. And what we want to say to politicians and to civil servants higher up in the hierarchy, that it's very important to look at the qualities of these urban networks and maybe potential relationships between these urban networks. So we proposed the idea of an urban network chain, a north-south network of a north-south chain of urban networks, and we symbolized it with this. And with hindsight, I think we used the wrong symbol, because people might think, oh, you want to stimulate infrastructure development, because people associate such a symbol with a corridor, and a corridor often means a bundle of infrastructure, and often also accompanied by urban development. And this was not our prime idea. We just want to draw attention, be aware there are, from a European perspective, very important urban networks located over there. Cherish them, stimulate them, be careful about the policies you design for these areas. So this map ended up in the bin. And you know, in the bin there are a lot of maps like this. And this map has been drawn far more neutral. I have to add something extra. One of the reasons why this map was rejected, that representative from the Netherlands, from my own country, and for Flanders were saying, we don't think in north-south relationships. That's not important for us. We think in east-west relationships. And that has something to do with a policy which you can name main port policy, emphasizing the importance of having a very large seaport in a territory. So the seaport of Rotterdam, Heerzo, and Antwerp. And the way these ports are nested in a system of hinterland connections, which by nature are pointing in a west-eastward direction, that's far more important, representative for Flanders and the Netherlands saying, than north-south relationship. That's another reason, apart from all the connotations with this line had on the map, also leading to the rejection of this idea, this proposal. And it ended up in this map, just individual urban networks with, not with a green, the green heart is here, but that's Dutch policy. You don't have to emphasize that in a Benelux document, but a green-blue delta area separating the Randstad from the Flemish diamond. So, this vision, this map is much more in line with, at that stage, dominant spatial strategies. So if it doesn't have any, you may conclude, any added value to these policies, because it doesn't add another perspective. So it's when there is no or just a limited level of a common planning culture, it's very difficult to propose novel planning ideas, novel planning concepts, and maps as a vehicle to present and communicate these ideas. A next example, even on a higher level of scale, is the European spatial development perspective produced by the member states of the European Union in the 1990s, 15 member states, together with the European Commission. And some member states have a tradition of national spatial planning, so spatial planning on a higher level of scale. Others do not have that tradition. In some countries there is a tradition of map making, visualization of planning concept and planning goals. Others don't. So map making, especially what I call conceptual maps, maps showing perceptions of territorial structure and territorial relationships, was proven to be very, very difficult and in fact impossible. Even some analytical maps were also impossible. And makers of this map again made mistakes. One example is this. It was made by Dutch people, I have to admit. And it's not very difficult why this map had to end up in the bin. And you have to look at the key of the map, which I enlarged in the right top corner. Predominantly urban areas with a healthy economic structure. Well, everybody wants to hear that. That's good. But nobody wants to hear that their area is a predominantly urban area with a weaker economic structure. Well, it's a good message to try to bring about if you can earn money from that. For instance, from European structural funds. But in this context, where this European spatial development perspective was meant to bring across policy objectives and policy strategies, this was not very clever to do, to use this kind of language. So this map had to be thrown away. This map as well. Again, Dutch planners had were playing an important role in making this map. You know, Holland is a flat country, and we are impressed by mountains. And we think mountains are barriers for transport. And that's, if you tell that to people in Switzerland and Austria, they say mountains are not barriers. Look at us, wealthy country. The only problem we have is all the traffic coming from Northwest Europe through our valleys to southern Europe. But you can see mountains are forming physical barriers, but also, that's a bit strange if you're coming from the Netherlands as a sea, how you say that, a country with a maritime history, that even seas are becoming barriers. Well, of course, for land-bound traffic, seas are barriers because you have to switch a mode, but seas also connect. So, because of this categories, this map was unacceptable to be inserted in the European Spatial 1991 European Spatial Development Perspective. And what was acceptable was a very innocent map like this, with distances. There was also one on climate and temperature, showing that it's colder in the north and warmer in the south. That was acceptable. But there is still visual language in the European Spatial Development Perspective in the form of icons. And all these icons are presenting policy objectives. Policy objectives with the makers of this planning document were found important to be integrated by countries and regions in their policy. Let me see. I'm not going to. They look like apps on your telephone. I've taken them out of the policy document and I've put them all next to each other and said, oh, it looks like my iPhone. If I'm correct, this is a kind of visualization of the idea that cities form urban networks, and there's a polycentric urban system in Europe. This icon is saying that. So these are diagrams, but still a sort of maps, because this line more or less symbolizes the perimeters of Europe. But as a whole, they are diagrams, they're icons, they're not really maps. But this kind of visual language proved acceptable. There has been exercises to invent other kind of visual languages for policy objectives in the European spatial development perspective. I don't have them here. If you're interested, I can send it to you. So, this 1999 European Spatial Development Perspective was followed up by another document called the Territorial Agenda, and that policy document doesn't have a map at all. It's just words, policy objectives. So, some conclusions on this European and what you can call transnational level. Benelux level is transnational. So when there is no real consensus on where planning is about, let alone some shared perceptions of how a territory is structured, there are often severe conflicts about maps. And in this situation, it's very difficult to arrive, if you don't have maps, to arrive at shared perceptions of territorial organization. So visions and vision documents tend to be limited to a collection of objectives, rosy objectives, balanced economic developments and things like that. And also a conclusion, and that's emphasized when I show you other, I'm going to emphasize when I show other maps, that professionals who make maps are not always aware of how others perceive and value images. Although they are important, planners are not always aware of what they bring about by designing images. So making maps at a European level was ridden with conflict, but is taking place right at the moment. And that is because some kind of research program has been established by the European Commission called ESPON. And that's the European Observation Network for Territorial Cohesion. They have a very interesting website. You can download all the dozens of reports. And this research program is targeted to map making. But map making, evidence-based map making about territorial organization. But not only that, the interesting thing is that the program, which was running until 2006, also included a scenario project. So you're not only studying and mapping maps about the existing territorial organization of Europe, but also about possible futures. And that's interesting. That is a kind of domain has created in a research program to make that possible, including maps. And under the present program, which runs until 2013, also territorial governance, not only territorial organization, but also governance is the object of research. And that includes map making as well. And the scenario project is followed up by other scenario projects. So I would like to invite you to have a look at this website, also because it touches upon a very high level of scale. So www.espon.eu. Free documents to be downloaded. So now I go to the Randstad level. Well, already explained you that the Randstad concept, the Randstad metaphor, is used to highlight the urban structure of the west of the country. And since the late 1950s, this has become a genuine planning concept, so a policy-ridden concept about territorial organization. But the Randstad concept goes back at least 3/4 of a century. This is an old map. This is a map from 1924, made by one of the founding fathers of spatial planning in the Netherlands, a guy called Van Lohuis. You may forget his name immediately. But he was member of a group of planning pioneers, thinking very hard about planning issues at the regional level. Well, there was even a clear tradition of planning at a local level, although municipalities had the competence, based on a planning law, to make plans at the local level. But this guy, Van Lohuizen, and other people in the Netherlands were advocating the necessity of a regional approach. And what Van Lohuizen did in an area where there were no statistical offices, so he was looking at census records from individual municipality, trying to find out what was the population growth between 1869 and 1920. And he mapped population growth. It's difficult to read, it's at the bottom. It's not very important, but basically shows how the darker the area is, the more population growth there is. And what Van Lohuizen detected, and you can read that in a book about Dutch spatial planning doctrine written by Andreas Verloudi and and Arnold van der Valk in more detail. If you look at this, Van Lohuizen in fact invented the term Randstad, Rim City, because it shows a band of cities around, in those days, an almost entirely open space. But it shows that there is a kind of urban sphere developing, a kind of integrated territorial developing based on growth, on urban growth. So that's something quite novel to bring forward, that such a structure is developing on such a grand scale. But what is also important, which is part of map making in general, but often forgotten, that the map in itself is a frame, because it's quite something to draw a rectangular around an area the size of this, and this is about 100 kilometers, that's about 70 miles north-south and the same east-west. To draw a line around an area and saying that this area should be the subject of a policy. So that's quite something novel in that period of time. So a key, I like the English word, we had a discussion yesterday, I like the English word key. In Dutch we use the word legenda, which is the translation of legend. But the word key, you use that here as well, the key of a key, you open a door with a key, but this and that's the key how you unlock the map. So there's one important part of every map, the key, but also the frame. And that's a very important decision, how you draw the frame. This map didn't, in the beginning, didn't lead to very much. It didn't lead to any sort of creation of a new planning act in which planning competence would be given to higher administrative levels above municipalities. I think in those days the Netherlands had about 800 or 900 municipalities. Now the number is 450 something. And our middle layer of government are the provinces, and there were 11 in those days. But that changed after the Second World War. Now make a jump into history. The policy environment changed, and also the idea of planning at a higher level of scale was becoming accepted. Provincial authorities got certain competence, but also the idea of a national spatial planning policy was becoming gradually, well, accepted, you can say that. And a major reason for that, and a lot of people were worrying about massive population growth and massive urban growth in the western part of the country. This is one of a series of maps made by a Dutch urban design firm called Must. In Dutch you pronounce as Must, but it is Must. You can go to their website, Must, I don't have to explain that. They are specialized in making very, very interesting maps. And they made a series of what the Netherlands, they made a reconstruction of the spatial organization of the Netherlands from 1850 onward, with jumps of 50 years. So 1850, 1900, 1950. And I'm going to show this because this is the Randstad area. It's very difficult to even see a Randstad because it doesn't show any, like the map from Van Lohuis, which showed a time range of 40, 50 years in one single map. This is just one moment in time. So you see a few cities in a vast green space. But people who knew statistics and knew trends were detecting that things were changing. So one of these people, there was an advisor of the national government called Jacques P. van Thijssen. He drew a map saying we have to be very careful, because if we let things go as they go at the moment, then the western part of the Netherlands could turn into what he called a sea of houses. And we all know the word utopia, but this was for planets a dystopia, that the western part of the Randstad could look like this. And this was part of a discussion in the 1950s of what kind of political reaction was needed for this massive migration from the periphery of the Netherlands to the western part of the Netherlands. People seeking employment, and also the building up of new industrial areas and the expansion of cities. So there was also in Parliament a lot of fear what could develop in the western part of the country. So the government installed a committee to study, to investigate the urban question in the Netherlands. They wrote a report, and this is the cover of the report. And I think this is a very strong image, because it shows you in a very simple way a key component of the advice of this government committee. But not only the advice, it became part of national spatial planning policy. The Randstad, which is hardly visible on this image of Must in the 1950s, is now an urban ring. The green heart is here, and what this message is saying that this green heart should be kept open, and in order to reach that situation, all these cities here should grow in an outward direction. And part of this growth should be taken up by new towns in a kind of ring, second ring around this rim city. So a kind of diagram projected on a vaguely imaged territorial structure of the Netherlands to bring across some very important messages. But this map doesn't say a lot about the desired urban structure of the Randstad. So this map was also made by the makers of this report. It shows you the large urban agglomerations of the Randstad, and the idea that they should be separated by green belts, like this. So a very sketchy, what I call a conceptual map. very simple, very simple graphic language, but it shows quite clearly with some underlying explanation what this map proposes. And this is the third map which I want to show you, also taken from this report, which highlights some operational decisions which should be made according to the writers of this planning document. So new towns of polders which still had to be made. Eventually this was never made. This one has been made. Here is Almere, a very important new town which might eventually become the fifth city in the Netherlands. A new town here which is being built. A new town here. Well, this became a new town. This became a growth center. It shows more precise perimeters of buffer zones and green belts. So this, I shall not translate what is all written in the key, but this map shows the type of operational decision making necessary to bring about the important spatial concepts that the makers of these reports were proposing. So I'm showing all these maps next to each other, different graphic languages, so different maps, different functions. So a very conceptual map, presenting some very basic ideas, more detailed ideas about the development of the Randstad and operational decision making. And this is how maps are often used in spatial planning, on a more conceptual level and on the level of on a more strategic level and on a more operational level. This is coming from a national spatial planning report from the mid-60s. I go back to this map. The assumption of people in the planners in the 1950s that it was that urbanization would take the shape of cities gradually becoming larger, growing around the edges. Less than 10 years later, researchers and spatial designers were saying, no, this is not happening. What is happening is suburbanization and the formation and the possible formation development of urban structures on a regional level and even on higher levels of scale. And that was, you can say, a kind of innovation for a lot of people. So the makers of this national planning document in the mid-1960s were doing their best to get this message across. And again, they were using a topographic underlaying is, oh sorry, I also have to use this one, is missing, but still this is a kind, these visualizations are forming a kind of maps to bring this message across, that the future situation could look like this. Urban, I cannot translate this literally, but you could say urban regions. The word gewest here is a very old word for a region. So city regions would develop. Simple urban region, one city, an agglomeration formed by two big cities, more complex patterns, and in the end, conurbations, a concept which was invented in other countries, but very quickly absorbed by national planners. And they also made this, and now we are turning into a kind of perception about spatial planning, very technical, very detailed, very blueprint-like. So, what could an urban region look like? And the makers of the National Spatial Planning Agency, which was established in 1965, drew up this pattern where each letter stands for ABCD, a kind of urban environment, a kind of urban area. A, more suburban, D, more urban. And eventually, this was translated. This is in Dutch planning history, this is one of the most well-known map, most famous map. This is a kind of what, because these planners from the 1960s were very much dominated by urban designers. So this is a kind of blue print of the Netherlands, a very detailed blueprint of the Netherlands. So this is called this map was called the block map, blokjeskaart in Dutch. And these blocks were not put there randomly. Every block was very carefully studied whether it would be appropriate to put a yellow block here, or an orange there, or a brown one there. And there's something interesting about this map, and that's part of the Dutch planning culture as well. And I had a discussion with Jaap yesterday and immediately emphasized it as well. The borders of the Netherlands are here. More or less here. But the makers of this map thought apparently, well, because we have this part of the Netherlands sticking out here, that's the province called Limburg, so this is this perimeter of the map. Let's propose how the city of the Belgian city of Antwerp could develop in the future. And Ghent, and Liège. So ideas of how the Netherlands could or should develop, I have to say should develop, were projected on the territory of a neighboring country. And there were, in fact, relationship between Flemish and Dutch planners, so it was done in a very friendly way, but in a way it's very strange that you use a kind of blueprint approach to say something about an area that is not part of your country. But the National Spatial Planning, there was always something arrogant about the National Spatial Planning Agency in the Netherlands. This map and the whole planning report was criticized because it was a blueprint. It didn't. There was the time of new ideas in planning literature, process planning, that alternatives were missing. It's proposed just one possible future made of blocks. But what was missing is a kind of operational decision making, especially on what was becoming quite urgent is the idea of new towns, growth centers, proposed in the 1950s already, and still no decision taking in the mid 1960s, and eventually in the early 1970s a decision was made. But what is interesting is that this, if you think about 50 years of discussion in the Netherlands about planning, starting in the 20s and 30s, people advocating for some kind of planning approach at the regional level, was not accepted by Parliament, and 30, 40 years later you have a national strategy with shortcomings, with important shortcomings, but there is a national strategy, and this national strategy is supported and communicated by maps and visualizations. I have to look at my time. I'm reaching my limits. Ten more minutes? Okay. Very quickly then, the idea of a Randstad an urban structure on a high level of scale evaporated in the 1970s. Small is beautiful, so large urban structures, we don't want that. And this map, although at first sight doesn't show that, but what this map emphasizes is that there's not, doing this again, there's not something very grand like a Randstad, but individual urban districts. So the concept of a Randstad became a place name, like Amsterdam, Rotterdam. It just there's a system of cities somewhere in the west of the country. But in the 1980s, the idea of a Randstad emerged again, not based on ideas about urban patterns or urban form, but about ideas about economic development. And planners, although the level of thinking is quite sophisticated, what kind of economic structure is developing in the Netherlands, again made major mistakes. What they have been inventing, so to speak, to a system of conference in regions with regional economists, but also with politicians and administrators from these regions, that the Randstad, as a concept to describe the economic fabric of the Netherlands, and especially the top of the economy of the Netherlands, so main offices, international offices, things like that, is far too big. That was the assumption of the national planners. Those functions can only be found in a part of the Randstad. And they called it the West Wing. This is a kind of image which didn't appear in any planning report, was made on the road towards a new planning report. And this concept of a West Wing led to enormous confusion, but also to a lot of opposition. Because what this concept did was looking at the Randstad in a different way and actually saying that Utrecht is no longer part of the Randstad. And that was unacceptable because representatives, and on a high, very, very high political level, the mayor of Utrecht, but also, and I've forgotten the English word, but let's say the council, the executive of the province of Utrecht, also opposing this, because this is negative city branding, what they were saying. Utrecht belongs to a kind of second division in the Netherlands, and that's unacceptable. Also, this idea of a west wing of the Randstad is cutting across new patterns of cooperation within government and between government administration. So the whole idea of a west wing had to be how do you say that? They had to be left. The makers of this, the inventors of this idea of the West Wing, they tried to save some ideas. They called it international business environment of the Netherlands. But eventually the parliament said, no, Utrecht has to remain a part of the Randstad area. So eventually in a kind of planning exercise, this image was developed. The entire Randstad is again here. Utrecht area, Amsterdam area, The Hague, Leiden area, Rotterdam, transport system, and the outer parts of the green hearts. So this is the last image I'm going to show, and then some conclusion and observations. In the 1990s there were debates in Parliament, but also among planning professionals, claiming that a kind of new approach for the Netherlands was necessary, and especially a new planning approach for the western part of the country. And that the Randstad concept should be reformulated, that the water structure of the Randstad is far more important than the old classic red green divisions, this kind of antagonism between urban and rural areas. And it would be far more important also to look at the accessibility structure of the Randstad. So not from the official planning organizations itself, but from outside by, let's say, an organization from civil society. Delta Metropolis Association proposed a new concept called Delta Metropolis. And to stimulate people to think that is really something new, they done something with the projection of the map. They turned it 90 degrees, just to stimulate people to think in another way about the Randstad. And also because this image is dominated by blue, the sea, and for that reason the river systems, the delta characteristics of the Netherlands stand out much more clearly. This is quite an interesting example of how you can use maps and even the projection, they turn 90 degrees, the projection of a map to stimulate people to think differently about territorial organization. Well, eventually you may even shouldn't come as a surprise, the idea of a delta metropolis initially accepted, but it disappeared behind the horizon because the old perception of the Randstad was much too strong. Well, I'm going to skip now a few things and we'll arrive at some conclusions and observations. A first conclusion is that visualization and maps are form an intrinsic part of planning. There's no escape, although there are lots of conflicts about planning, but at least in the Dutch tradition of spatial planning, you need maps, you need visualization. But maps come in different shapes and different forms and different languages. So there's not one kind of ideal map or ideal visualization. There are very different languages you can use. What I hope I made clear by discussing the transnational and European level, but also think of the Netherlands in the 1920s and 1930s when there is no kind of institutionalization in terms of spatial planning, meaning shared ideas, ranging from shared ideas about spatial planning to the setup of organizations, facilities and things like that. Maps often lead to conflict and confusion, but maps can be very influential in introducing new approaches. Think of these maps about the Randstad in the 1950s. Partly with an emphasis on more conceptual maps and diagrams, partly on more detailed maps. New themes, new scales being introduced by planners or advocated by planners in a first phase. Professionals are not always aware of the potential sensitivities of symbols, of metaphors and territorial labels. I have been discussing maps now, but like Jaap was saying in his introduction, there are two language domains in spatial planning. The language domain of maps and visuals, but also the language of domains of words and metaphors. And they are linked to each other. And you must be aware of, as a spatial planner, as a designer, the communicative value of a map could bring about. Well, the top sentence I have not been able to explain, but the function of maps and visualization in Dutch planning has changed in recent years. It's not, it's far less on a more conceptual level, but maps are now used to illustrate projects and operational decision making. So I've shown you very conceptual maps. They are becoming rare. So there's a shift in visual language and a shift in the type of maps which are being used in Dutch planning at the moment. So interpreting and making sense of territorial organization, bring about innovation, framing, that's no longer, at the moment it could change, especially, could change again, especially maybe under a new coalition government. That could change, but framing, which I can call frame, is no longer a prime goal, but it's still a very important function. Framing, develop new ideas about territorial organization. I only have to refer to the literature on transition management, to a free planning from locked-in situations, from doctrinal situations. Well, I leave the observations at the bottom because I have to be able to discuss the spatial images which has led to these observations. So I draw an end to my presentation and end up with this beautiful image of the territorial structure of Northwest Europe made by a colleague of mine in the Faculty of Architecture, a colleague called Verena Balz. Thank you very much.
So we're trying to rethink planning in Florida. So what can we learn from this? What do we do? Because we think, I think, in words. We think in goals, objectives, and policies. If we think about a map, we think about a, should be on. That's green. Okay. Now I lost my train of thought. All right, so if we think about a map, we think about a future land use map, we think about a zoning map, but how do you use these conceptual maps and how can we start using them? I know that's a tough question to start.
It's a tough question, but in trying to answer that, maybe I can refer to some discussions taking place in the Netherlands about what, there has been a lot of criticism on spatial planning in the Netherlands over the last few years. It has been too much dominated by government, too much dominated by people from Dutch administrations, too much dominated by professionals, and that spatial planning should open itself to other groups, to other stakeholders, that it should try to line up with, for instance, if you talk about the regional level, people taking important decisions, for instance, about where is future education taking place, where are new hospitals being built, important decisions which might change the territorial structure of a region. And to be able to discuss that, you need to develop a kind of what is called by some people a kind of soft spaces where people from various backgrounds can work together, discuss together. They might get support by planners just to make images, for instance, or maps of possible territorial structures in an area, but not planners as professionals taking the lead in planning process, saying what should be done, but more a planner as a type of networker, working together with other people, and be a bit more modest and humble about their own ideas about ideal territorial organization. But it has been shown, for instance, by a colleague of mine who's now working in Nijmegen. I think she has been publishing in journal articles as well, a lady called Linda Carton, that in planning processes, people, urban designers who have a skill of translating discussions and key concepts in maps can facilitate discussion enormously, because they can, a map and the simplification or the level of abstraction you can reach by making maps of visualization can stimulate discussion enormously. It can raise conflict, but if it's done in a clever way, it could bring forward important discussions. Maybe this is a first answer to your question.
I have a question or two and then a comment. We in the United States do not use the word spatial planning at all. Is spatial planning as a word, as a metaphor, going to hang around for another 20 years? Or is it is it running its course?
That's difficult to forecast, but the concept of spatial planning, of course, is a kind of literary translation from the Dutch and even from German, Raumplanung. There was a moment in time when it looked like that spatial planning was becoming as a kind of description for a kind of policy or working domain at a European level to get to be accepted. But that's not the case, no longer the case at the moment. And now something has appeared which is quite vague at the moment, but because it's quite vague, it's acceptable for a lot of people. And that's the idea of territorial cohesion. You heard probably this word. There are at least 4 or 5 different interpretations of what territorial cohesion means at the European level, but also at national level, at European level. But because you can put so many messages in territorial cohesion, that's often the case with policy concepts, it is acceptable. So spatial planning, with all its connotations of tactical planning and blueprint planning, might disappear. And what is in fact disappearing at the moment in the Netherlands, that's the term which I have to use Dutch now, but I will say it in an English way. That's the term planology. And if I pronounce that in a Dutch way, it's planologie. And that term is gradually disappearing because it has this history of detailed planning and how you say that, of space, and I'm going to use the word again, spatial planners who know best about what to do and what kind of decisions to be taken by politicians. And because this concept has all this history, and that maybe that's what you're implying with your question, then you might look at the gradual disappearance of terms like spatial planning and planology.
I'm actually looking for a word to frame the map-making exercise, whether it's spatial planning or territorial organization or territorial cohesion, something that sort of says that you need to do this.
Territorial organization, I find quite a good concept, or spatial structure.
Yeah, well, I love that too, because I'm a geographer, you're a geographer. But the other interesting thing that I heard from this conversation was the whole Benelux planning exercise, because to some degree we are Benelux. We have Palm Beach County, Broward County, Miami-Dade County, 3 countries, sort of not each each keeping its own records, each having its own maps, and we want to sort of map the entirety. And what was interesting is that you chose, or whoever did this, chose to find the one or two dimensions that were important to all three countries and then mapping them. And so the question is there a set of references? When did this happen, first of all?
This second structural, this second outline for the Benelux with this north-south chain, you mean that one or the first one?
Either one.
The first one was that process took about a decade, and it ended up in 1986. But the other one that was finalized in 1998. That took only 2 years to make in a kind of pressure cooker situation. While you were saying this, I was asked, in the Benelux they are thinking, what should we do as a follow-up of this Benelux structural outline from the late 1990s? We are 10, 12 years later, what should we do? Should we try to update it, try to develop a new structural outline? And several people were asked to give advice. I was one of them. And although I was participating in the making of this, what is called the second Benelux structural outline from the 1990s, I said, don't do it again. Don't make a kind of planning document which has a kind, although it selects a few issues, it's still rather comprehensive in its ambition. And I said it's much more interesting to select a more limited set of urgent themes which you all have in common and try to start from these themes separately to draw up a kind of common ideas or common strategies. And of course one of these urgent issues is infrastructure, partly for the mere fact that two major European main ports located quite close to each other. That's an issue. Ecology is an issue. Water systems are an issue. So a more restricted set. It started leaving from some idea of comprehensive planning. Try to start from planning for more urgent issues with a much more narrower set of problems and a much more narrower arena of stakeholders than comprehensive plans have. Does that convince you in one way or another, Dave?
Does narrowing mean focus?
More focus, yes, more focused. Because that's spatial, I'm using the term again, spatial planning in the Netherlands, because this past history is a kind of big concrete block which you try to draw while you're walking. You should try to get, sometimes it's necessary to get rid of part of your history to develop something new. And the idea of comprehensive spatial planning, because in a kind of European international comparison, the Dutch planning system has been described as a comprehensive integrated approach. That's planning in the Netherlands should be more modest and more focused in its ambition.
Europeans have some concepts like, for example, functional urban regions, megacity regions, and in America they are translated, or they have synonyms like what we have with megapolitans, what we have with metropolitan regions. I'm curious, as a European looking from outside to America, how does our language, planning language, sound to you?
How you're playing it?
In American.
American. I know there have been claims here that in the United States that some kind of planning discussions should be developed. I think it was called on the mega region level, and I think this concept was important from Europe, and I find it fascinating that European discussions, although they haven't led to any sort of common approach in Europe, because there is no common planning approach in Europe. There are discussions and documents have been produced, but the mere fact that in Europe people have been come together to discuss things is already important. And if that kind of I'm not certain how to call it, if that kind of beginning of a tradition is taking up on the level of the United States, I find it extremely interesting, because there are a lot of important issues which at this very large level of the United States are also crying for kind of strategic planning approaches. For instance, infrastructure linkages between cities, but also water management. You have delta areas as well with very problematic situations, and they call for a kind of strategic approach at higher levels of scale. It doesn't answer your completely, because I'm not familiar with all the language being used right at the moment in the United States. But learning from each other is extremely important. Although you always have to aware where what you might take from another country, another region, that's written with context, and you should be aware of the context of origins, and also the context of where you might possibly apply certain approaches. And that's sometimes people forget that when they want to in discussion about best practice.
I actually got a question from somebody online, so
Okay.
I'm going to read. That's
Yes,
what
I
I
know
was
we
doing.
are online,
I wasn't texting, you know. I was actually paying attention. So the question here is, how does the public consume these maps? Are they appropriate, useful for public consumption? And don't ask me to clarify the question.
I have to admit that most of these maps don't even reach the public. And that has something to do with the fact that over the years, in the Netherlands at least, that planning has been very much developed as a toy for professionals, as a toy of professionals. So I've only shown you the tip of an iceberg. Maps and images taken from official planning documents. And if you look at the Netherlands, there's a whole world of nice maps, planning schemes, journals, books, highly appreciated by the planning communities and the planning professions, and appreciated by some people working for newspapers, etc., but they don't reach the larger public. And I think planners have to change their approach. They have to become much more modest, much more trying to link up with stakeholders, and even individuals can become there are stakeholders in planning. So planners should do much more effort to reach out beyond their own parochial professional domain. That would be partly an answer to this question, but also a rough sketch of what planners could or should do in the future.
All right, well, it's 7 o'clock. So, well, before I thank you, I want to say two things, though. As somebody who knows what planologie actually means, because I'm Dutch, what he just said, and you're saying it's disappearing, it's becoming less important, right?
Planology departments in universities are evaporating.
So what is really scary is that our planning is their planologie. Those are really the same things. So it's really interesting to me that in the Netherlands that is disappearing, and here we're trying to rethink it. Because that spatial planning is really different. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that you're talking about that in Europe, where people have very different opinions and very different ideas and different planning system, through this system of creating these maps, they're still able to find common ground. And I think that's a real challenge that we need to start thinking about. What are the common grounds here that we can work up to create those kind of images? But what I take away from this is that even in Europe, they haven't done really well at communicating those ideas to a larger public. So I think the challenge remains. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.